What's your one piece of advice?
But now you put me on the spot.
Hi, friends. I'm James from James Ware Reads. Today, I sit down with independent comic writer Jon Auerbach. Jon was kind enough to send me the first 3 issues of his series Blood of Atlantis. I read and reviewed them over on my Instagram page. I enjoyed them so much that I asked Jon if he would come and sit down and have a conversation with me. We talk about how he got started writing, what it's like to write a comic book versus write a novel, how he met the artist he works with, what it's like to table at New York Comic Con, and even, very briefly, the Muppets. I can't wait to share the interview with you. Hello, friends. I'm James with James Ware Reads. Today, I've got author Jon Auerbach. He is a novelist, and for the purposes of our channel, is the writer of the comic book Blood of Atlantis. Thanks for being here, Jon.
Thanks for having me, James.
So, Jon, for people who aren't familiar with you, can you just introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. My name is Jon Auerbach. I am a comic writer and fantasy author from New York City. I'm a lawyer by day, and I do my creative writing endeavors in the earlier morning and late at night. I live in Manhattan with my wife and my 3 kids. And I started writing short stories, I think, 13 years ago, and kind of built up to books, and then got back into comics in 2019, and eventually decided I wanted to try writing.
I'm curious to ask you all kinds of questions about your career, but before we get too deep into it, can you give just kind of the elevator pitch for Blood of Atlantis and why folks should pick it up?
Sure. Blood of Atlantis is a modern epic fantasy where our characters live in a world that seems like our own, but there's like an undercurrent of magic under the surface. And it's about a group of New York City-based questers who are searching for the lost city of Atlantis.
That's awesome. I knew your books were all set in New York, so I was curious to see if you lived in New York City or worked there. It reminds me a lot of the old Marvel writers who were writing basically their hometown because they were all New York City based. That's really neat.
Yeah, I tried to. My first book called Guild of Tokens is only, I think, takes place in New York, and there's a lot of kind of locations that I either have been to or really studied very heavily on Google Maps. So I try to lend it a little bit of realism and city life. Yeah,
I haven't read Guild of Tokens, but you've got the audiobook up on your YouTube channel, and I started listening to that this morning. I really, really enjoyed it. It's super fun.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Tavia Gilbert, the narrator, is really great. And then for book 2, I decided to kind of just record it myself to keep it going, because that hasn't been recorded yet.
So tell me, what made you decide to become an author?
It was about 13 years ago, or 12 or 13 years ago, and my oldest kids, I have boy-girl twins. I think they were 1. I think I remember walking back from seeing X-Men Days of Future Past in the theater, and I don't know, that kind of like resonated with me about like a story. And I had around that time found Chuck Wendig does these flash fiction prompts every Friday, and that my friend had linked to once. And I think on a whim, I just started, I like picked the prompt that week and like wrote a 1,000-word flash fiction piece, which I thought was really good. But I think if I read it right now, I would probably disagree with my past self. So from there, I just kind of kept doing the prompts, trying to do them every week. And then eventually I kind of came up with my own idea of what if there was a section in Craigslist called quests. And then I wrote a 1,000-word flash fiction piece about someone recounting their first 5 quests, and traveling around New York City and doing random things, stealing stuff, borrowing things and earning tokens in response after completing the quest. And then I kind of sat on that for a while, and then eventually I kind of tried, expanding that story, and that kind of first 1,000-word piece became the prologue of Guild of Tokens. And then I started building out this I call it an epic urban fantasy, epic urban fantasy world. And that was over 10 years ago.
You mentioned I think part of what makes your world building so interesting to me is that message board kind of grounding of it. It's such, I think we can all imagine finding this corner of the internet with these quests to pursue, and it's such, it really grabs me. So there's a lot of urban fantasy worlds out there. What do you think makes your particular setting kind of unique or special?
For whatever reason, I never read kind of the traditional urban fantasies where like it's, the hidden world is not so hidden and it's, like the Dresden Files type of urban fantasy. I read more kind of secondary fantasy, not maybe my mid-20s till now. I started. I didn't really read so much when I was younger. I like the idea of like kind of a grounded world and like, kind of taking the Harry Potter of this like hidden undercurrent that only a few people knew about, but I trying to weave it in a realistic way that, and in developing a magic system where magic is not really innate. It's like part of the world around us because kind of the thesis of the system is like magic is this kind of a natural resource that has existed, for a long, long time. But in the current, status quo that Blood of Atlantis and my books take place, it's, very diminished because it's been used up. And what could happen if, magic had kind of seeped into random things and what could we do? What would we do if we actually like found them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it lets me kind of play with, real myths and also like history. In the books especially, there's kind of a secondary story that I tell in epigraphs at the beginning of the chapters. And yeah, it's just fun. It's lets me kind of, use the city I live in fun locations, without, I'm envious of the authors who have, it takes a lot of mental energy to create a whole secondary world. So urban fantasy, you can borrow, from what we already have.
So you mentioned you're drawing on real myths and history. Is there any particular part of the world or mythology that you find inspirational or that you find yourself coming back to a lot?
I really like Greek mythology. I played Hades and Hades 2 in the last couple of years, which, have lots of Greek mythology. And that was really fun. I also really liked kind of the Arthur mythology from England. I was a big fan of Gargoyles, the animated show that was on the Disney Afternoon. And that show, like, they took every myth that they could get their hands on and wove it into the show. And it was so great how they did that. So I kind of take that tack of if it makes sense. I try to weave that in, and I also like to weave in, historical events and see if is there like another explanation that we could give that's like when something weird happened.
Did you grow up reading mythology and folklore, or is this something you discovered later in life?
So I'm submitting for a new anthology that's going to come out on Kickstarter. Hopefully, I get selected. That's about mythology and monsters, and so that's the one-page prompt that I'm currently writing now. I'm writing kind of my background. I remember reading Edith Hamilton's Mythology, I think in middle school, and that just has like all the myths in maybe a little sanitized way. So I read that, as a teenager, and then we had some adaptation of the Odyssey that we read also. I remember reading that and really liking that. And then they had right around then they had a miniseries on NBC back when they were, doing TV miniseries.
Yeah.
And they also had that Merlin miniseries that starred the late Sam Neill. So that all came around, right when, I was in middle school and high school. So I really kind of latched onto that.
Yeah. Yeah. I read Edith Hamilton's Mythology. I think it actually might have been in high school, but I'm familiar with her book. I remember enjoying it.
Yeah.
So you wrote, how many novels have you written?
I've written 3. So the Guild of Tokens is the first book. Guild of Magic is the second book. And those follow the same character in a first person point of view. Her name is Jen Jacobs. That's kind of her story. And then the third book is kind of a standalone / spinoff from that world called Guild of Tokens, Guild of Magic, the Gauntlet, which takes place after Guild of Magic, but it's kind of designed to be a fresh entry point, and it has new point of view characters, and also guest stars from Blood of Atlantis. So it's fun, kind of moving people from the different mediums in the larger story.
So you've written 3 novels, and you're writing Blood of Atlantis. After writing, why a comic book?
So the short answer is I read comics when I was in middle school. It was like maybe elementary school, like The Death of Superman, I think came out when I was in 4th grade. Simpsons comics. So I was a big fan of The Simpsons, and they had these really fun Simpsons comics that were coming out at that time. And then I kind of fell off because being a comic reader, it's a lot of work to kind of to keep up with everything. And so I rediscovered. I tried to read Jonathan Hickman's Avengers, New Avengers arc right when Secret Wars was coming out in 2015, but kind of fell off because, again, comics and comic reading order is hard. It's a lot of work. So then finally I found out about Hickman's new X-Men run. So I said, okay, I'm going to this seems like this is a good jumping on point. It's coming out like right now. It was about to come out. So it was the summer of 2019. And I read that first issue and was like I didn't have so much experience with the X-Men comics. I watched the animated show in the 90s. So reading that was like kind of like a revelation, and the new status quo he was building was so cool. And then they spun out, House of X and Powers of 10 into the new series. So then I kind of got hooked, and just kind of my comic pull list kept, growing and growing and growing. And then I actually attended a seminar that Andy Schmidt at Comics Experience, and who's also now the editor-in-chief of Boom Studios, did with Jonathan Hickman. So it was like in the middle of the pandemic. And I went in going as kind of just, it's a fan, they were talking about how he rebooted the X-Men. And I, my interest was just hearing how they built the story. But I came out of that also wanting to write my own comics. So that was kind of, that was the beginning. And then that was 2020. So then the first issue of Blood of Atlantis came out in 2024. So it was a bit of a journey, but a fun one.
Talk about the differences between writing prose fiction for your novels versus writing comic books. What's that like?
So when I'm writing prose, I typically try to write in the morning, like when I'm fresh, getting a big coffee and some breakfast, and sit down and write and try to get in flow state. And I have time before my day job that I can do that. I try to outline with like big tent poles. I'm not a big, some of my writer friends, will outline the entire book chapter by chapter and then go back in and write it in. I try to do kind of a combo of that, where I have a couple of tent poles and smaller things in the different parts of the story, and then I try to write to those events. But I find if I try to write, after work, my brain is just kind of too tired to get into flow state. And so what I find with comic writing is it like works a different muscle. It's a little more, it's really creative work to do, but it's a little more like a puzzle trying to figure out what pieces can fit on the page. And so if I'm writing a script and I don't have any prose to write at the moment, alongside that, I could do that in the morning, but I can also find like I still have like the mental energy to do that at night. And the other big difference is, you have to be just thinking, you want to be thinking visually when you're writing a novel, but, comics, it's just so essential, and you have to be able to, you have to try to visualize what this is going to look like on the page so that it's, interesting for someone to read, in addition to kind of the words that, and the dialogue.
In terms of, because you're thinking about it, the dialogue and the pages and layouts, like, do you sketch out the comic pages, or how does physically, what does it look like to write a comic with that in mind?
I've seen some writers who do thumbnails. I think I saw a tweet or something from Romvi the other day where he had kind of posted his like rough layouts. I've heard of other writers doing that, and I feel like it is a good idea. But it's more just like, okay, and I've tried to now outline more so that I'm not just writing pages and then getting to the end and being like, oh wait, well now this doesn't work. But yeah, it's trying to figure out, okay, how much action can we fit on the page? How many panels does that need? You don't want to drive your artist crazy with 9 panels on each page, each showing very complicated layouts and backgrounds. So it kind of starts with, okay, like let's take this, scene by scene and then break it down and say like, what can we do on this page? And what can we do in this panel? That's, one action. And so it is hard sometimes to, pacing it out because you want a lot to happen but you have to take the space to make it happen. So it reads well. And that's why having, a good artist to partner with is essential, because the artists, they'll take the script and they'll put their own spin on it. They are working in a visual medium, and they make the script, so much better. Not just in terms of illustrating it, but okay, like this story, you wanted this, but like this makes more sense. This is going to be more interesting. And so that back and forth is like really like what I love in collaborating, which you don't get just writing a prose novel.
Yeah. How much are you? So you're working with the very talented Francine Delgado as your artist. What's that back and forth look like? Like, is she contributing a lot of ideas to the script, or what's that look like?
So before each issue, we changed it up a little bit for the 4th issue. But for the first 3 issues, I would write the whole script, send it to her, and then we would have like a Zoom that could be anywhere from like an hour or 2 hours, and we'd go through the script page by page, and she would give me, her thoughts. And so, after those sessions, I would go back and make it. I don't remember them being like huge changes, but like good changes to make. And then so I'll send that to her. She'll start doing layouts. This 4th issue, I did like a page outline where I wrote down each page, this is what happens, so we could kind of see the larger story. And so I sent that to her instead of the full script. And so she gave me feedback on that, changed that up before I wrote the script. So that I think was, a little more efficient on my end. So I didn't, once you get in the script and trying to make, big changes could get kind of tricky. So then once we're in layouts, she'll, once she's doing the art, she'll send me the layouts, I'll give notes, then she'll, we'll talk back and forth about things if we need to. And then, we'll move on to inks, and it's kind of the same process. The best part when we're in production mode is, so Fran's in Vancouver, so I'll go to bed with and have, maybe I've heard from her, but I'll wake up and there'll be like pages in my inbox to review. So that's always super fun. And so then I'll, give comments on those, and we kind of go back and forth. And Fran also colors the series. And so, we just iterate through the steps. And at every point along the way, we could be kind of making changes. Like I remember for issue 3, there was like the characters kind of dive down into this cave in Mexico and swim to the other side. And it was a really cool looking page, but I realized like they just like, they go in the cave, they swim, and they come out. And then unfortunately, only after I got the art back, and I was like, we really need to like create some sort of tension or conflict on this page, because it looks great, but it's not so interesting. Yeah. Like the dialogue. And so for that one, Fran like added another panel where they're kind of swimming through these underwater like stalagmites. And then, I added some narration to kind of heighten the tension. But that doesn't usually happen. So like I also want to have an eye towards, okay, what's interesting happening on this page? How is it contributing to the story? So we kind of don't avoid that, because it's a big ask to to add and change the art once it's already gotten that far.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you made that ask because I actually remembered that page and I liked that page.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm really curious about as someone who spends a lot of time with comics are what makes comics unique as a medium. Do you find that working in a comic book changes the types of stories you're telling or has different strengths and weaknesses you're pulling on versus writing a novel?
What I really like about comics that, I've heard, I think, Rick Remender, I think, said this in a recent interview. The great thing about comics is you can tell a small scale, medium scale, large scale story with a very small, close knit team, and for arguably not a lot of money. Yeah. And the other kind of mediums available to it, like it would be great if I could go make a movie, but I don't know anything about filmmaking other than maybe writing a script, and you need dozens of people if you want to make like a cool fantasy big blockbuster movie. So the scope of what you could do with comics is the full scale of that. And I think sometimes I kind of go back and when I get an idea, I go back and forth about is this a comic idea? Is this a prose idea? And I did like a writing exercise I guess it was 2 years ago, where I tried to write a 5-page script every day to just kind of hone my muscle. Wow. And I wrote these like short vignettes about some of the characters in the Guild novels that I'm now taking and making them into little 1,000-word flash fiction pieces. So some you can kind of take pretty whole cloth and just kind of fill in the details, and it works. And then some of them are like, no, this is really like a visual story. This is made to be a comic, and it just kind of came out that way just when I was writing it. So it's I tried to be more. Now that I've kind of written comics and going back to prose, I'm trying to be more, think more about how visually the scenes are, and try to add fun moments that would look cool if people are visualizing them, which you're not necessarily thinking of all the time when you're writing prose, but you have to be thinking of when you're writing comics.
Yeah. That's really interesting that to hear about how comics have influenced your prose writing. Did you find that moving from a prose writer or comics, there was any strengths that you'd learned there that you were bringing into your comic book writing?
I had, I'd written lots of dialogue in my prose novels, obviously, so I had experience with that. But when you get into comics, you cannot write it, and you're kind of setting a scene. You can't have the scene go on forever because you have limited space. So it really forces you to kind of distill down the dialogue that you could get away with kind of a longer, wordier scene in prose versus comic. I guess more generally, comics and prose share the spine of like story structure. So I read I had listened to a lot of podcasts and read books about story structure, and so having that background going into when I from prose and going into comics was super helpful. But again, we're dealing with kind of a different unit of story with the 20 to however long 20 to 30 page single issue versus maybe the a 2,000-word chapter. So they do translate, but you have to think about them in different ways.
I think there's probably a lot of us like you that have read comics and have gone like, I kind of want to try writing one of those. Of the story podcasts or books that you read that helped you understand story structure, are there ones that you particularly recommend?
That's a good question. Let me try. So for comics, I think so. The Comics Experience the website that Andy Schmidt runs, and that they have these whole classes. They used to do a weekly podcast where they would interview creators, but I think there were more episodes on that, kind of more about kind of the nuts and bolts. I listened to David Harper's off-panel podcasts pretty much every week. Just to that's more of kind of hearing about the creators and the stories. They don't get so much down into the, nitty-gritty how-to. So I'm trying to think. Yeah, I did that I took that seminar with Jonathan Hickman. This was 6 years ago, and then Kieran Gillen has done a master writing class. I think not through the BBC, through one of like the British, through like the Guardian, I think. And so I took that maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and then he offered it again. It was pretty much the same class, but like hearing him talk about it again live was like actually very informative. And his newsletter, he has a weekly newsletter where he talks about, the books he's writing on and how he's writing. And so I try to, I guess, subscribe to, writer and artist newsletters. I subscribe to like Clayton Coles's letter. I think he has I guess it's weekly. He's the big letterer for Marvel and some DC books. So that's to kind of learn more about lettering. I think it's a good thing to kind of know about all the different parts of making a comic book. And Kieran Gillen has like has a page on his website where he like links to all kind of his essays and other people's, essays on comic writing.
Mm-hmm.
I think I wrote a piece on my Substack about how to write a first issue. And I think there's like a link to some resources at the end of that, which I haven't looked at that in a while. But I asked a bunch of writers and artists, they're like one piece of advice on how to write a first issue of a comic, which was a fun piece to put together.
Yeah. What's your one piece of advice?
Now you put me on the spot. If you want to write a comic, I guess the prerequisite is you need to have read a lot of comics and kind of take note of what you like and what you don't like. Read a lot of first issues. I think I read a lot of first issues and mentally noted what worked and what grabbed my attention. And I think recognizing, sometimes I think, and some of the writers I think who responded to my question on this said like, sometimes you just need you need more room in the first issue. Like writing a first issue at 20 pages is really, really hard. So recognizing that it's okay maybe to go a little longer, I guess, depending on kind of the project you're working on. If you're working for a big 2 publisher, they're probably not going to give you more pages than you get. But like a creator-owned work, like it's important to let that first issue, proceed at the pace you want to kind of, because you have one chance to kind of hook the reader with your brand new story. These are brand new characters. And so sometimes that requires a little more space, more pages.
Being a couple of years removed from your first issue now, is there anything looking back you would have done differently?
I think going back against what I just said, I think I would have tried to hit it a little bit shorter. So that first issue was like 34 pages. And then the second issue, I think I also hit it 34 pages. And so the third and fourth issue are a shorter 32 pages. But it's a different skill to be able to write. If you want to be a writer and write for a publisher and work on their IP, you only get what they're going to give you. And so it's much more difficult, it's a much different task to write a 20-page story than 30 or 28, 30, 32, etc. So being able to kind of deal with those different story lengths is important. There's also a balance of, the longer issue costs more, both, for the art and, for printing. So there's a lot of kind of considerations to like think about. But then again, like sometimes I think the first issue of Monstrous is like 60 pages.
Wow.
And but that story I think really needed it.
An element we haven't talked about yet. How did you find the team to work with while you were first putting together Blood of Atlantis?
So I had gone to New York Comic Con pretty much every year since the early 2010s, but I actually hadn't really I hadn't made it down to Artist Alley until 2021,
Mhm.
believe it or not. I went with
Wow.
my cousin, and we went on like the show floor, the main floor, and like walked around every time. We didn't really realize that Artist Alley was there. So 2021, there was no Comic Cons really in 2020. 2021, New York Comic Con came back. It was a little smaller than usual. And I had met some folks online through Substack and through Kickstarter campaigns. And I went to their table to say hello as they were sharing a table. And I said, "Oh, do you know any?" And I was kind of still at the beginning of my comic writing journey. I said, "Oh, do you know any, artists I should check out who are looking, for work?" And so they said, "Oh yeah." One of them said, "Oh, I talked to Fran Delgado. She's, further down the aisle. I think she's looking for, she's available and looking for work, to work with writers." So I went down to Fran's table and introduced myself and took her card. And then I think the next summer, I was doing the Kickstarter campaign for Guild of Magic, and as one of the stretch goals, I decided to do a 5 or 6 page short comic. That would be the goal. And so I emailed Fran. I said, "Hey, remember we met at New York Comic Con? Would you be interested in working on this? Here's the script." And it was really, the script was like this story of someone doing their first quest, but there were actually no words. It was just going to be complete visual. There was maybe little captions to say, do, step 1, do this, step 2, do this. And Fran said, "Yes, definitely. I'd love to work on it." So she drew it, and we hit the stretch goal. She drew it. She connected me with a colorist she had worked with before, Raul Angulo. So he did the colors, and then the letter, Tobin Rasicot, I had known from some of the other Kickstarter books, like Beastlands. So I reached out to him. It was very minimal lettering, but he kind of made this like, little text box that looked cool.
Mm-hmm.
And so we put that out. And then when I decided to, I came up with the idea for Blood of Atlantis, I was looking around for artists, and I reached back out to Fran. I said, "Hey, I have this, bigger idea now. It's going to be a series. Do you want to work on it?" And she said yes. And so, yeah, and then we went from there.
So I know you mentioned you've been a guest at New York Comic Con a lot, and now you've tabled at New York Comic Con to promote your comic. I imagine there are just so many folks promoting their comics at New York Comic Con. How do you stand out?
That's a really good question. So, Fran tables at New York Comic Con pretty much every year. So she let me come share her table with her for a couple of slots that we promoted it. We had the first issue, and she was on an aisle right next to Dan Mora, who she's friends with. They're both from Costa Rica. So we were right next to Dan Mora. We had this huge crowd coming, and you have, and Fran has these great other kind of art prints that she sells of like popular characters. So you would see people kind of like turn the corner. They want to wait for Dan, but they would kind of look at Fran's art prints, and then and I'm standing there, and I'm like, well, we have our creator-owned creator-owned series. You've never heard of it. You don't know who I am, but let me try to tell you about it. And I remember standing there being like, this is really hard. Like I've been on the other side, obviously, like walking down the aisles, like looking for cool stuff. And so sometimes we try to talk to people as they walk by, or sometimes they would stop at the table, and then you have, 5 seconds to be like, here's the pitch. I'm trying to hone that kind of log line, is really key. And if you have that log line, before you start even writing the series, and it resonates with people and it makes sense, like that's even better.
Mm. What's your 5-second log line for New York Comic Con?
Blood of Atlantis is like Dungeons and Dragons meets Indiana Jones with a modern take with a spunky female hero.
It's a great pitch. That was
Yeah.
because I was unfamiliar with your comic, and one of your reels of you unboxing some of the finished comics popped up on my feed, and I saw the Indiana Jones homage covers. I'm like, yes,
Yeah.
this is exactly what I've been looking for to read.
Yeah. We've done 2 of those covers so far, and they're really fun. And it gets to kind of combine something, that people know about with kind of our characters in a fun way. So I'm glad I'm glad that cover drew your eye.
It did. And it evokes a lot of the tone that you're going to get inside, which is exactly what it should do.
Yeah.
I'm really part of what is fun for me with talking to or hearing interviews with creators is hearing about, I've always loved watching behind the scenes featurettes and deleted scenes. I'm kind of fascinated by this almost happened. This was an idea we almost went with. Do you have any of those stories about Blood of Atlantis?
When I wrote the first issue, the first draft of the first issue, I think it had a whole different ending. I won't spoil it because the ending is kind of, as you know, it's kind of
it's really good.
big cliffhanger. So that scene at the end went an entirely different way, and then I gave it to a friend who's a TV writer, and he gave me some great notes, and that draft of the script also I think went way too heavy on the other world building and what had happened in the books.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, well, maybe some people are going to read have read your books and read this, but like probably most people aren't. So I think you're trying to do way too much here. So the beginning, kind of the intro, where we're kind of learning about Beatrice and kind of what she had done beforehand was way more detailed. So I kind of scaled that back in like a fun way still, that we're like learning about her and she's kind of narrating her adventures to someone. But yeah, the ending, I went like in a kind of a 90-degree turn. And then I was kind of, I guess, sitting with the script and I said, what if we did something completely different? And then from there, that kind of snowballed into the following issues. Mm-hmm. And we're still kind of dealing with the repercussions of what happened at the end of issue 1. Even it will be in the current issue.
How many issues do you anticipate the story being?
So right now, my goal is and we're almost there. We're going to to finish out kind of this volume with issue 5. So issue 4 is Fran has finished the art at the beginning of the month, and she's now coloring and working on the cover and working on kind of the Kickstarter promo image, which she just finished the other day, which looks really cool, which I'm going to hopefully put up in the next couple of days, and then we'll hopefully get issue 5 out, at the beginning of 2027, and then collected. And then we'll probably take kind of a step back and see where things are. Mm-hmm. Because the other piece of advice that a lot of people have told me and said, I've heard on podcasts is like, don't go into your first comic project wanting to write like a 60-issue magnum opus. So I kind of want to, build the story, maybe, 5 issues at a time. So I have kind of ideas for the next 5 issues and maybe vaguer ideas for the next 5 issues after that. But yeah, the goal right now, we want to get like a nice collected edition, get those 5 issues done, and see where the story will take us.
Looking at your comics and at your novels, are there any particular themes or ideas you find yourself coming back to?
Yeah, it's kind of going back to that kind of theme, going back to, walking out of kind of Days of Futures Past, which is like kind of thinking about, okay, there's like one change in the past, like changed everything. So it's like, how does, one moment kind of like echo forward through time, whether it be myths or like something in, our characters, more immediate past. So I kind of explored that idea in like the first short story I wrote in, I think, 2014, which was, I guess what I was thinking about, earlier this week, but I forgot about it until right now. I really loved the book Cloud Atlas. And I think that, that both from a kind of a story and perspective and a structure perspective, you have these nested stories that are building one on top of each other and then going in reverse. So I really loved that structure, and kind of how, they carried kind of the idea and the theme kind of through all of those stories.
So a single change in the past rippling out. Are you going to write a time travel story?
Not a time travel story, but my books have kind of these epigraphs that are kind of diary entries from someone several hundred years in the past, and they're kind of telling their own story. Like I don't know if you've read kind of the Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn books, and I guess Stormlight Archive also, but they have the beginning chapter epigraphs, and for Mistborn especially, like they're telling those epigraphs. You go back and read them, kind of. When you get to the end of the book and go back and read them all in a row, you can see this story that's unfolding just in that. So I kind of layered on that, historical story with those in the books in like a fun way. As far as the time, I have an idea for a time travel story, but that'll be for a completely different project.
All right. So I have one last big question for you, which is the most important one. So Disney Plus calls you up and says, we want to adapt Blood of Atlantis for a limited series. However, the entire cast will be played by Muppets.
Okay.
Who are you going to cast as the characters in Blood of Atlantis?
That is a great question. And I love the Muppets, and I'm very sad that they closed the Muppet 4D spectacular at Disney World. Let's see. I guess looks-wise, Beatrice could be played by I don't remember her name. One of the Muppets who's in Animals Band, who kind of has the similar look with the blonde hair. And then Damon's friend Topo, probably Fozzie. You got to have Fozzie. I think it's Damon's Topo is more of a lighthearted character. Damon maybe played by Gonzo. I don't know who would play Svetlana. She's kind of the fourth main character. She's not really, her and Miss Piggy are not really similar characters at all. So I'd have to come back to you on that one. But I would want to work in Statler and Waldorf somehow, because
obviously
you need those two cranky guys.
I feel like they could fit in with some of your flashback scenes to Atlantis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, John, thank you so much for taking a chance to connect with me. Where can folks find you on the internet?
Yeah, it's been great, James. You can find me at jonauerbach.com. That kind of has a rundown of my books and comics. Or if you go to bloodofatlantis.com, that will either link to kind of that'll link to like the most recent Kickstarter campaign, and that'll have kind of a link where you can buy the issue. Or if once our next campaign is in pre-launch and launch mode, it'll go to the next campaign. So that's probably the easiest URL to remember.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, John.
Thanks so much, James. This was great.
Thank you guys so much for sticking with me here to the end of the video. You can find me here on YouTube and on Instagram at James Ware Reads. If you watched all the way to the end, remember, you are deeply loved, and you've got this, whatever this happens to be today.